One of the data sets that we get is records that are produced by Statistics Canada every year based on the tax records of people who submit their taxes. So we get a sense of incomes and the sources of incomes from across the city, but it's a really big data set. It's one we really started acquiring through a national program called the Community Data Program. Social Planning Toronto is a part of that. The library is part of that. A lot of other organizations in the city participate. But the challenge with it is that this particular data set we started acquiring not long after the National Household Survey happened. For those of you familiar with social statistics will know, about 5 years ago, we switched from a census to a voluntary survey. That created concerns about the quality of data that we were getting through that, and income would be certainly part of that. So we started looking at other options, and this was one of those data sets that we started looking at. So we started acquiring that at a level that we could look at what was happening in neighborhoods. But we now have a national census back. A lot of our energies are focused back on looking at that and planning for when that information starts becoming available. So we have this great big data set that we haven't really had the opportunity to explore. We said, well, let's open that up. Let's see what people can find in it. It's got about 3,500 variables in the data set, so there's a lot of stuff to play around in. And so we brought this challenge to see what could people come up with, what might they find interesting to look at, and were there more useful ways to make that data set accessible or visualized for people.
Right. So we kind of all work together as a group. We took different approaches to sort of looking at the data. And I'll just show you sort of an overview of the things that we came up with. If you're interested in sort of data and big data and the way that it's used in organizations to make sense of things, this is actually, I think, like a really good kind of nutshell example of like the possibilities and potentials with data and also kind of the problems and where it's difficult to deal with. And so maybe you can think of the solutions in terms of like two kind of different genre, like two basic strategies. One is an idea of, well, maybe just even to back up a second, like as you can tell, Heath, who's been great during this process, by the way, just like very accessible, communicative for like a couple of weeks now. And the reason that's important is because you need a domain expert when you're talking about a lot of data, right? We come as sort of from the public, we know a little bit, but all the sort of details and exactly what the city's looking for and how that plays into their poverty reduction strategy, that's all a little bit of a mystery to us. So it's very helpful to have somebody who can kind of guide us through the millions and millions of data points. And in a sense, what he needs is a way to just kind of be able to explore that data and sort of our competencies to help him. And one strategy among those two that I mentioned, which a lot of big players are involved in, and this, for example, is a solution that's provided by Google that Sarah and Dustin, who's not here today, worked on, was basically uploading the entire data set to sort of like a, well, in this case, Google, but there's a few other players involved in this space where they sort of provide you tools for being able to explore a huge data set. You know, you kind of give them all your data, and then you can do things like what you're seeing on the screen here, right? And you can look at, sort of add different elements, different variables that you want to look at, compare them against each other. I'm not going to go through specifically what we're looking at. It's more like just the idea I'm trying to get across. So if, for example, we got something like this that was working in a very dynamic way, it's something that Heath could take back and start using at the city to explore the data himself. On the other hand, where this approach can sometimes fall down is, it doesn't have the flexibility of a human mind, right? You're kind of stuck maybe in the structure of the way that the data's been uploaded. Maybe you can't do certain kind of math or change the data, mutate it in a way that brings out certain values that you want. So some of the other approaches that we took had that in mind. So for example, Sharmali and I worked on something specific to sort of rates of child poverty in different neighborhoods. So again, this involved more of a kind of a human approach in the sense of like manipulating the data, finding out the rate of child poverty in certain neighborhoods, highlighting the neighborhoods that seem to have a lot of change in them. So we created a few charts, and then also, so for example, this chart shows like the 10 neighborhoods that have had the most change in child poverty over the 4 years that we had data for, 2010 to 2014. and sort of just compares how those things look. And then Sharmali made some really great maps of sort of the same data. Again, it's very data rich, and I'm just kind of giving you sort of an overview of how that looks, but we can talk about it later if you're interested. 5 minutes. Chuck's, maybe you can talk about your data. You took a different approach.
Okay.
You want me to set it up?
No,
Okay.
So Keith gave us a large data set, and we looked at there are different things to look at there, and it was very interesting. And I worked on the employee insurance benefits. Permit me, I'm pretty new to Toronto and Canada. So he explained what it means and how it affects poverty and everything. And from what you can see here, it's each dot represents a neighborhood in Toronto, and it's pretty interactive. So you can see the percentage of people who collected employee insurance benefits, and the city or the neighborhood in which it was collected in. And this is like the richest neighborhood, Bridle, something, York Mills. And
Bridle path for those who want to throw.
Bridle. Yeah, I'm very new. So, and you can see that the average income is over 200,000, and they have the least percentage of people that rely on employee income benefits. And there were some outliers like Bay Street corridor or something. Yeah, and you can see like very low income and low employee benefits. I think these visualizations is not just about crunching the numbers and working with tables. It's about like asking questions from data to drive some insights to ignite some change. Because there are some interesting things that I noticed too. Because I looked at the mean of all these, and I was like, okay, so the mean of this, the average of this, should correlate with the unemployment rate in Toronto, which was exactly right. Like the mean of this is like 6.7, and I checked online for 7.2, the unemployment rate in Toronto. And from this data set that Keith gave us, there are a lot of things we can infer. There are a lot of questions that we can ask. There are a lot of models that we can fit and variables that we can change to predict what can happen in the future if we can change some variables and really tackle the issue of poverty in Toronto.
And then we had a choropleth map that Derek worked on. You just want to describe it to us.
So similarly, what I thought was important is just to be able to explore what was going on. So what's mapped here is the economic dependency ratio. So there are many things that we could explore. The economic dependency ratio is essentially looking at, I guess, what sort of a ratio between the amount of benefits that are used within a certain area as opposed to earned income. So the darker colors are where people have, I guess, earn a majority of their income comes from earned income from a job as opposed to supplemental income from government. So the idea here is just that you could explore and see what are sort of outliers here. One that I think repeatedly came up as we were exploring the data set in different ways that I think is interesting is that Bay Street corridor, which just seemingly counterintuitively comes up as one that has a high economic dependency ratio, which just for people who are from Toronto, I don't know, that seems to be a bit weird. So the whole goal here is just that you can explore and ask more questions, and then there's a lot of data there, so you can dive deeper to figure out what is this that this means. So hopefully this can help.
And I guess maybe just to draw out the kind of themes that keep repeating and come back to the beginning. So, there's the kind of the automated approach, like the Google kind of data explorer, but then a more kind of Q&A approach where the domain expert, Keith, sort of works with somebody that can kind of create charts, and slowly it's almost like a conversation where you're interrogating the data, if you will, and you find out stuff about it. And maybe so for the long term, what that might mean is either to provide like a very flexible sort of automated thing like Google or one of the other people, or for in the long term with the civic tech community, maybe for him to work with us to keep exploring the data because we've just scratched the surface.
Thanks very much, Aura.